All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick off, and this will be recorded, so those who are running late or can't make it will, of course, get this. First, I want to thank everybody for attending. I say this to people a lot, that the most important thing that we have is time. It's the only thing we can't get back. We can make more money, we can buy another car, we can do all that stuff, but we can't make more time. So I appreciate the investment in the time, showing up. Hopefully that this will be informative, interesting, and fun. Hopefully we've got a good group here. I think that they know how to jump around and create some value for everybody. So first, I want to introduce everybody. I'm Jim Begley. I'm the CTO here at ARG. So within the organization, I'm really kind of responsible for product pricing, those kind of things. And I'm sorry, Lindsay. Lindsay is running the deck, and I'm going out of order. So I'm responsible for product pricing and helping the organization kind of make technology decisions within the team. Larry Parscale, who's on with us from ARG as well, is responsible for cloud and managed services. So he is the product lead for those things within the organization and works closely with the providers that will be helping us today. The providers we have today: Tom Hood. Tom is, you can see there, he's head of channel solutions architecture for Entirety. Tom also is an avid golfer. Now, the interesting thing about Tom, from my perspective, is that he lives in the tips of New Hampshire, so I think he only gets to play golf for 3 weeks out of the year, based on where he's located physically, unless he's traveling, of course. But he's been with Entirety for a while. He's got a deep understanding of technology and those things, and is a great assistant and great help for us within these solutions. Brent, who I have had some time with individually, he's a guy who travels with his family, looking at softball fields. Actually, we were talking about it earlier. He was down here. He's in Columbus. I think Columbus, if I remember correctly, Brent, right? Yep. That's okay. And he was down here in Northern Virginia on the softball fields just this summer, watching his daughter play, and so a lot of fun there. Brent is actually at the highest certification within the VMware stack for VMware Certified Design Expert. So long tenure in VMware, deep domain expertise and understanding in that space. Mac McClenathan is from 1111 Systems. Know Mac for a long time, go back a long way. Mac has been really working within the channel system for about 15, 17 years, I think, really. And has a deep understanding of this as well. Just really lives in this space, understands the space, is a domain expert as well within how to develop partners and how to help make these kind of evaluations as we go through what is the VMware stack and how do we decide where infrastructure should be and those kind of things. The other thing about Mac is that he has a alternate personality with his 2011 release, I believe, of his country album. You can go look it up, but it's not under Mac McClenathan. It's under gosh, I'm gonna get it wrong. Mackie Roberts.
Oh, that's spot on.
Spot on. Okay, good. I was like, oh man, I'm not gonna pull it. It's not in my brain now. So we have an eclectic group here, and people who can really add some value to the organization, to your organization, and really help you make some thoughtful decisions as we go through the process. Now, if we could go back to the agenda real quick, I do want to talk on that, and apologize, Lindsay. So I'm going to jump in and do a market overview. So I want to talk a little bit about the market. We're seeing some dynamic changes and some shifts, and this impacts organizations differently, but we need to talk about it. And then Larry will cover our Broadcom overview, and then we'll get into, with the folks on the call, the different aspects around VMware infrastructure versus DR, kind of what's going on in that marketplace, how to evaluate what are the other options if it's not VMware, and that's really the next three kind of bullets there, right? Software as a service, hyperscalers, and then alternative hypervisors if that's an option or a choice for the organization. So just go through that in QA. Now in the QA, right now all of the phones are locked, so you can't ask questions via voice, but we do have chat open. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in there. we will attempt to grab that and answer those questions in real time if it makes sense. And if not, we may get to them just at the end. So just know that we're collecting them, and we'll jump in there as we can. So with that, I'm going to jump down to a market overview. So VMware has obviously been changing quite a bit, and there's been you can go to the next slide actually. So there's been a lot going on, and we talk about it, and everybody's moving to the cloud, right? But what I saw, this is last year, a little dated from July of 23. 63% of IT workloads are still running on either a premise or a leased data center. That is a significant workload. Now, of that, I've seen estimates, I couldn't find data to back this up, but I've seen estimates that about 80% of that is running VMware. That's a big, big number. That's a lot of workloads. That's a lot of infrastructure that's still running VMware out in the ecosystem. I'm going to compare that with Azure and AWS. So their expected growth rate, and this was published last year or earlier this year, would be 15 to 20% revenue growth year over year, quarter over quarter. Actually, last quarter that was just announced, I believe that AWS was at 21% growth year in the quarter, and Azure was at 19%. So they are exceeding those. Their revenues this year will be about, each of them will be about $110 billion in revenue. They will double about, they're going to double every 5 years at least, if not. That is a big number, and that is a fast growing number. I wanted to actually bump that up against some interesting numbers, because when we look at the revenue associated with Dell, VMware, HP, those individually, those two cloud providers, not including GCP, not including Oracle Cloud, are actually about the size, maybe a little bit smaller than the revenue of those three companies who we think of as the dominant players in that space. So when that dollar shifts, we're seeing some major impacts of that dollar shift, right? That's not a one for one. And of course, there's people resources wrapped in there for running the infrastructure and operations and all of those things. But as that's growing, part of what my hypothesis is, and we're going to talk about here, would be that we need to really evaluate the market, where the workloads live, what the capabilities are, and what we're really trying to get out of the resources and size and scope of things. So at a high level, that's the market dynamics that I think we're seeing right now. And just wanted to refresh that and make sure we're all current with kind of where the market is in general. Larry, do you want to talk a little bit about the Broadcom service?
Yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, so this is somewhat just a recap. This is kind of what made us go to this next webinar, because we did a webinar before, and we had a lot of providers. And let me go ahead and back up a little bit and state by saying I get the opportunity to work with these providers pretty much on a daily basis. All of them have little unique perspectives on how they accomplish their solutions, and I love bringing these to our customers, these providers. So thank you guys once again, but for being here, I appreciate it. So Broadcom, of course, when I purchased VMware, everything just kind of blew up. So just a quick recap of what happened. So it went from perpetual to subscription-based. Some of our clients were lucky enough to get a 2 or 3 year extension into that, and so they're able to have a little cushion. A lot of our clients were not so lucky, and they just got hit with a big bill. One of those things is I went from RAM-based to a core base. So one of the things we're going to talk about today, and I want to ruin it, but disaster recovery as a service. So even if you, in DR, it used to be if that VM wasn't on, you weren't charged for it. Well, now you are. Now, granted, there's some nuances there, and some of our providers have come up with ways, not around it, but to help out our customers. And that's some things we want to talk about. As Jim brought up earlier, the increase, we're seeing anywhere from 200 to 800%. I've got a client right now that won't mention their name because they would hate that, but they went from $200,000 a year to $675,000 a year, just based on the new pricing. And what makes it even more difficult now is the amount of resellers that they have. It's great for Broadcom because they don't have to deal with many people, but they went from 4,500 to 500 for resellers. Luckily, we have a great base of providers that can help out in those areas, and we can overcome all of these things. So that brings us to, what do we need to do next? Should I stay or should I go? I'm getting this question constantly from our clients, and luckily with these providers, they have options. But let's start off with VMware. If you would go to the next slide, please. So should I stay or should I go? So VMware, the impacts and the options of that. So infrastructure as a service, disaster recovery as a service. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have Brent start us off talking about infrastructure as a service, what it means, it's expedient, but also I'm going to have the other providers kind of give their take on it as well. And then we'll move on to disaster recovery as a service, and we'll have Mac from 1111 kind of get into that. But again, it's going to be totally interactive. Again, if you have any additions you'd like to make, please throw it in the chat. We'll get to it as soon as we can. But with that, let me toss it over to Brent. And, if you would give us your thoughts on infrastructure as a service and what that means to you and your team.
Sure. Thanks, Larry. Yeah, so that VMware change was pretty drastic on the service provider side as well. So Expedient, we've been doing infrastructure as a service for about 17 years. Majority of that, 95+%, has been on VMware. So definitely a huge impact there. So not only kind of the bundling changes, but also the individual consumption models that we were kind of moved from. So for instance, Larry mentioned kind of using RAM-based in the previous generation of VMware. Now we're on core-based. So whereas previously we could kind of load up boxes with CPUs, have a lot of extra resources for burst, things of that nature, now those are getting charged to us on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that Expedient was able to do, it was actually an architecture design decision we made about around 2020, is we actually deploy most of our workloads on a multi-tenant platform. So what that means is, like, individual clients aren't attached to a specific piece of hardware. They're really just consuming the resources off of that hardware. So one of the projects that we have in flight right now is actually taking that underlying architecture, revamping it. So not kind of a rip and replace, but doing some adjustments to CPU ratios, RAM ratios, things of that nature. And so because we decided in the past to do that multi-tenant overlay and abstraction layer, we can actually remove physical hardware from the back end of the infrastructure, reconfigure it, whether that's changing CPUs, adding additional RAM, things of that nature, to make it much more efficient. Because when you look at kind of actual overall consumption of resources, generally CPU is not your bottleneck. So we've been able in the past to put more CPU in there, but now that we're getting charged for it, we're able to then reallocate more RAM to the individual boxes. And what that allows us to do is do that operations change on the back end with no service impact to our clients. And they get to then take advantage of the cost savings we're passing through. So this project, we estimate it's going to save us about $3 million a year just in VMware licensing. So when we look at the overall impact of the VMware licensing to our clients, it actually only ended up being about a 5% change for our clients from that perspective. So that flexibility is working with a service provider is something that, like, really clients get to take advantage of, because as an end client, if you've already bought hardware, it's very hard for you to do it because you're probably using that hardware, you're consuming it at a high utilization ratio. So getting the flexibility to work with a service provider really opens up a lot of opportunities to minimize the impact from the VMware licensing side of things.
Great. And I'll ask a question here, and Mac or Thomas, if you want to answer, it's fine, or Brent, you can as well. People think historically when somebody says infrastructure as a service, people tend to automatically think AWS Azure. Right? It's just a flip that seems to go into people's brains for some reason. Can somebody kind of distinguish from that perspective? When you say infrastructure as a service in a VMware cloud, what is the differentiator there between those types of solutions? And whoever wants to jump in that, I appreciate it.
I could take a swing at that. I mean, when we're talking about VMware infrastructure as a service, I think when you talk about public clouds like AWS or an Azure, that's kind of the cloud, and then IaaS kind of gets dropped down as the VMware infrastructure as a service, at least in the circles that I run. And the main differentiator there is it's still, there's a private and there's a shared infrastructure option in a lot of cases. But from a migration standpoint, from customers that are already familiar with it, it just is a much lower learning curve. And you've got more service providers that are offering it in a static model, static billing model versus a usage based, right? Ingress, egress. Most of the IaaS providers out there are a little bit more of a static billing model with an interface that the customer is already familiar with, if that helps.
Yeah, to kind of chime on to what Max said there, right? I've been having those conversations, because we've been doing hosting, for 25 years plus. And when you start looking at the infrastructure as a service, it really started, in my opinion, to emerge as a viable option, right before COVID, because a lot of industries and a lot of businesses started to say, hey, we don't want to spend all this money on new hardware. How do we reallocate this and make it more efficient? And by having the VMware as the underlying basis and the software that they're all familiar with, it was very easy for them to adopt that. And when we started looking at, the virtual private cloud or a multi-tenant solution, I kept getting a lot of customers getting confused. What are the main differences? So I'm a big analogy guy. The way I kind of looked at the analogy of it is multi-tenancy is very similar to an apartment building where you don't know what your neighbor's doing, but the difference is that you don't have to now pay for your electric, your gas, your heating, and your maintenance. And just like an apartment lease, at the end of it, you're able to make a change and go bigger if you need to. And the virtual private cloud is really, in my humble opinion, going to be more of you're basically renting a house, where just like you own a house, all of the same feature and functionality and multi-tenancy, but you don't have any neighbors that are directly next door. But just like a house, it's not a quick process to put an expansion on it or put an addition in there. So it's very, kind of really what the customer is needing for the business outcome. And I think those are the two things that have drawn a lot of folks into this world because of the flexibility, but it's also the static capabilities that Mac and Brent both mentioned.
So you see in a marketplace, you see a lot more of not private cloud coming up now, because before what I would see a lot of is private cloud and then backups private cloud, but because they just couldn't let go of that. But now I'm starting to see a lot more private cloud, but now my DR, okay, let's throw that on something else that's not private. Are you seeing that kind of mixture now, or is it everybody just going more shared environment?
Yeah, so it's kind of on the DR side, a lot of it is more the shared environment because you don't have to make that investment in dedicated hardware. You're not entitled to all the costs that come along with it. So even on DR, you want to have redundancy built in. You want to have the additional power capabilities, things of that nature. So by going more of a multi-tenant, some of those pieces like the electricity that Tom mentioned, it's not things you're having to pay attention to. It's just you get to consume it as a service. We also see from a production side of things, a lot more people moving to the multi-tenant side as well for the same reasons. With kind of a billing and consumption perspective, on the production side, for instance, you have a lot of physical limitations. So in the apartment analogy, if you need to build on, you're having to wait for the construction crew to come up to put all the infrastructure in place, to get your electricity, your plumbing and everything built in. Whereas in the multi-tenant solution, when you need additional resources, it's really just a reconfiguration and you have it immediately. So you get to consume from a larger pool of resources. So that flexibility on the production side really merges kind of from the on-prem traditional hardware and the hyperscale. It's a good middle ground where you get those cloud consumption models, but with technology that you're familiar with, that your engineers are used to working with, and you're used to consuming.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
can I ask
I've always equated,
sorry, Larry.
I always equated private cloud was for a customer that was a server hugger that was letting go of their baby just a little bit. So, and that next evolution was really hard for them, but yeah.
Exactly.
That's
Sorry,
funny.
Jim.
No, you're good. You're good. So, Mac, then from a DR perspective, so 1111, you all, when Gartner had a DR Gartner Magic Quadrant, which I don't believe they do anymore, if I'm remembering correctly. I could be wrong. You all were obviously a leader in that, and you were focused around VMware then, as well as other things. But Can you give us a little bit, like, how has that market changed? Has that been changing for you since the, this Broadcom acquisition, and if so, how?
Yeah, and I'll even back up further to when all of this went down. I mean, that was obviously disruptive change, and Brent mentioned it earlier. It was very impactful on service providers. So it was pretty much the only thing I was allowed to talk about for 6 months of my life. But I think we all have a better understanding of actually what happened and a better feel for the actual trends. There was a lot of speculating early on, hey, this is such a disruptive cost increase. There's going to be this mass migration. I don't think we thought that was actually going to happen, and turns out it's not. I mean, I think the most recent trend report I've read, Wakefield Research probably did a survey, and it's like 32% of VMware customers are contemplating alternatives, and I think that marries up with what we're looking at, is because when we talk to end users, it's not necessarily mass migration, but more of like a mass awakening. Like, why am I running this workload here, right? Does it make sense to move it somewhere? How does this change the economics of running my own secondary infrastructure? And that's really, I mean, probably the quickest trend that we identified just in our own base. And just for context, we've got about 6,000 customers globally. A lot of that's in the data protection replication space. And when we started to we started to hear some common things with which each conversations. Hey, when we bought our production infrastructure last time, a year ago, we took the old gear and put it in our DR facility, right? So there's less depreciation concerns. They're less married to that underlying infrastructure. That investment's already been depreciated fully. So if I pay this license increase, and one example that we saw early on was an organization had 2 facilities that they were running, production, DR, and test dev. Their license cost in 2023 was $640,000. And then in 2024, the renewal was 1.1 million. And after, a lot of design and consideration, right, of where these workloads were going to go, they elected to turn down their DR facility and swing that to us for disaster recovery as a service, primarily because it's consumption based, right? They're not buying underlying infrastructure. They're not buying the storage, they're not buying the licensing. They're buying kind of a managed DR service at a savings and cutting off about $500,000 in licensing. So for context, they cut off right around 600,000 in licensing when they cut the test dev and disaster recovery out of the renewal, and then reallocated that to about a $15,000 a month disaster recovery service that included not only the replication licenses, but the underlying storage and then burst compute. And that's a key point, because if they're going to renew on their owned infrastructure, they're fully licensing that stack as if it was production. With us, and Brent alluded to it earlier, because let's call it my 100,000 cores spread out across the globe, I have the capacity to still sell it as a consumption-based services. So they're bursting into those resources as they need to, but they also get a lot more management oversight on the actual solution itself at a lower cost than they'd pay for the license renewal.
Yeah, and one thing that a lot of organizations don't take into account in that TCO and evaluating that disaster recovery is not just the things that Mac mentioned of the VMware licensing, the compute, things of that nature. If you're closing down your DR facility fully, you're also removing things like real estate taxes, electricity for that building, any physical space reclamation that you can then put towards other use cases, or just getting out the facility in general. So that helps that TCO when you're looking at a service provider to go to that DR model. It's not just the infrastructure, it's not just the VMware licensing, it's the full supporting underneath infrastructure for that workload.
Yeah. And kind of along the lines of the new cost benefit analysis, when you're looking at disaster recovery as a service, it just kind of opened up more conversations about, well, where do we want to target that, those DR workloads? Is it a scenario where the customer is already evaluating like an AWS or an Azure, and they want to start exploring, what if we use this as a first step as a migration, right? If I can replicate from my VMware infrastructure to an Azure, to an AWS, what are the possibilities? What are the tools involved? And we actually picked up some pretty interesting use cases through those conversations as well, especially if there's larger, more complex environments that include things like Oracle and all that. Public cloud may be a pretty solid option. And so walking customers through that path has been very enlightening.
Yeah, to tee off of what Mac said, right? One of the things that I've been seeing a lot of is you know, traditionally with DRAS, they were looking, hey, I want to have everything that's in production fail over. And traditionally, that was something that we could do, right? And now we're dealing with the changeovers with the cores and this. And I think to use Mac's line of the mass awakening, is that they're now realizing they don't need everything to fail over. So it's having the conversation of what is going to be business critical to ensure if there is, when there is a disaster recovery, what needs to be failed over and where. So again, it's really looking at understanding what the business outcome is, because a lot of companies can run with, you know, only a few of their key impacted systems up, versus in the traditional sense we were seeing, and I think everybody here on the panel will echo it, they were like, we want a 1-for-1. And a lot of us were having those conversations of going, do you really need a 1-for-1? And it didn't make any difference back then, but now it does. So I think opening the eyes of what really needs to be recovered and when, I think that's the more important question that is now getting raised, is what needs to come up and in what order. And all of us that are on this panel are dealing with those questions in all different ways. But we're able to help them and ease the burden of the disaster recovery, because it's not if it happens, it's when something happens that you need to ensure that you have something in place to ensure that your business is going to stay resilient and you have the continuity in place.
Yeah, Mac, I think I think this probably would be a decent place to do the public cloud pricing and kind of go through that. And we got a question here about, you know, the move to AWS or Azure for multi-tenant solutions. You know, the dynamics there is very expensive as well. But yeah, we can hit a little bit on the public cloud pricing, just a couple minutes there before we press on.
Yeah, I can do it. I can do it pretty quickly, but I found this one super insightful because, again, at the beginning of all of this, all of these changes, some of the conversations we tripped into was more or less just because of our status with VMware. So, you know, Brent's in the same boat, right? We're the top tier pinnacle status with VMware. So we had a lot of inbound conversations about, hey, you guys have a seat at the table. Did we make the right decision? So we had a group out of Florida, enterprise customer. They're running about 6,000 VMs in total. 2,000 of those are in AWS already, and the additional 4,000 are still running on-prem. They elected to renew their VMware licensing just because, as you can imagine, that would be quite a disruptive change to migrate away, but it was substantial. So they signed a 3-year renewal before and got some discounts. But they essentially wanted to ask us about, you know, was this the right decision, or how are you guys looking at it? Because we were, you know, we have obviously a large infrastructure ourselves. The interesting way that conversation went was my line of questioning had more to do with, well, you already have AWS resources in-house. You already have 2,000 VMs there. Are you investing in resources to support the AWS environment? And the answer was yes. I mean, that's where they're primarily investing, and not in resources to support VMware. I'm like, well, is the plan ultimately to move your VMware infrastructure into AWS? And like, no, I'm still paying less for these 4,000 VMs on-prem than I am for 2,000 VMs in AWS. So it seems almost counterintuitive that they're investing in AWS, but they're renewing and retaining that 4,000. So this is an enormously disruptive change. And it's not as simple as one cloud provider is cheaper than the other cloud provider, or one path's cheaper than the other. There's so much more of how does that workload function, and doing the actual analysis on that workload, and is it factored to run to maximize the AWS model for both production and the resilient HA functions. And how does that impact usage, right? So it's not a this or that, it's let's look at and back way up, look at those individual workloads, like I mentioned earlier, figure out where they're most optimally to run, and then create a strategy around, you know, migration over time. But to your point early, Larry, it's not a, if I migrate to public cloud, I'm going to save money, because that's absolutely not the case.
Right.
Yeah.
When we get into hypervisor, the alternate hypervisor, I think we should definitely touch more on that, because a lot of people don't understand the lift and shift aspect of this as well. So that's definitely going to be another huge impact. All right, let's move to the next slide, if we could, please. Software as a service. Thomas, if you would start us off on this and benefits there.
Yeah, so a lot of the things that we consume in the business world are now software as a service. And what I think accelerated this was originally good old Microsoft coming out with O365 with these great bundles, showing folks it's nice and easy that you can get into a subscription. But now with this change, specifically around VMware, I have had multiple conversations of how do I reduce my resources? How do I maximize the servers that I have today? And what can I move out? And then you're now having a conversation really of, well, what softwares are you looking at? Because a lot of the big ones that we've mentioned, right, like Azure Directory, that is a software as a service that can live on a platform as a service, which is in the public cloud. Or you have now the larger behemoths like Oracle and SAP, they've adopted that software as a service model. So what that's able to do, and some of the benefits to organizations by looking at, software as a service, or how and why to do this as a service, is it's reducing the actual demand on the on-prem. Because the one thing I will say, and hybrid is not dead, right? Not all applications should live in a public cloud. Not all applications should be software as a service, whether it be for compliance or whatever reasons. But this is driving adoption to have people have conversations that previously I feel that they were a little uncomfortable because, to Larry, to your point, we've always had to deal with the server huggers. And a lot of those older generation are looking at this as, well, it's taking away from my day to day, when they aren't looking at it as they're taking away the mundane aspects of ensuring that the underlying infrastructure of where that software lives and that application, now that's being offloaded. So you're outsourcing the risk, but you're also adding in the value to the organization that now you can start looking and saying, hey, maybe I don't need to do all of these servers because I offloaded so many VMs because this software now is actually coming in as a operational expense over the capital expense, which a lot of those businesses are now really looking at it from, I think we've all touched on it today, is those soft costs that nobody thinks about. Servers are power hungry. You need to make sure you have adequate cooling. You need to make sure that you have the subject matter expertise. And some of these softwares that we've seen, they're not easy to do. And by moving it to the service, you're now getting the support package. You're now getting where you can start bringing it into a different platform and it allowing for you to really start that journey into a hybrid environment, whether you want to keep stuff on-prem or you start moving what you can and what you feel comfortable to that SaaS model. And it starts to show you a lot of those things that we've all talked about today. And it's going to reduce the total cost of ownership overall and bring in a more redundant and resiliency for the organization.
I totally agree. I actually had a customer years and years ago that kind of reminds me of, he actually had a coin-operated laundry business, and part of his website is a credit card on his own servers. And I was like, you're a laundry guy. What are you doing? Get this out, get all that other stuff off of yours. Go to, do your office stuff on Microsoft Office. Don't do it here. Don't do it locally. So, yeah. So Mac, what do you think about that as well? You got any ideas on software as a service? How deep are y'all into that as well?
Yeah, I mean, from a software as a service standpoint, that's the M365, the Exchange servers were the first to go. I mean, we're seeing migrations, slowly but surely into those models as they become viable. Always, early on when the application launches the SaaS offering, oftentimes it doesn't have parity with the original application. So there's a slower adoption period with some. So, we just kind of manage that change over time, and you start getting into a lot more data protection conversations and honestly, third-party risk assessments with your software as a service, providers as they mature their offerings over time. So that's our involvement includes data protection more so, and then vendor assessments, like third-party risk assessments against these software providers as they evolve.
Okay.
So it's interesting from my perspective, and sorry, I'm going to jump in. is that we were talking about it when we really started on the DR stuff. We were talking about workloads, right? Where the right workload is, where the right capability is. SaaS solutions should be evaluated as part of that, right? What makes sense to be SaaS? If you're running Exchange on-prem, you may have a very valid business reason for running Exchange on-prem. That is absolutely true. But that is the minority of clients would have a business reason to run Exchange on-prem. Now, when I look at it, I think that, and Mac, you hit on it exactly, is that again, this is around those capabilities that are protecting the organization. We don't think about this. I know we're talking about this in terms of VMware, but the reality is that when we go to a SaaS application, we then have to be aware that that has to be integrated into our business continuity and disaster recovery planning. Those things then become so critical to how we operate. We have to leverage them, whether it be a solution for your email that's a proof point, a Mimecast that is giving you some resiliency. Not that I'm advertising either of those, but those capabilities, the backing up and recovery around Office 365 with Beams and other software with a provider around them to help leverage that, and even within getting into your CRMs, right? Very few people are running a CRM today on-prem, unless of course you're a CRM or AMS company, and those organizations are doing that, but we need to make sure that we're backing up our data, that we're protecting it, that we have the ability to reload, recover, and refresh that data when they do it. So it is a holistic approach, and this is just one of them, right? It's the software as a service. And before I move on, Brent, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that around the SaaS stuff. And
Yeah, I was just going to echo what you were saying. Is like you're offloading the security, the backups, the disaster recovery, the business continuity. That's a benefit, but it's also something you have to take account of. How are you gaining access to that data? Do you have any workflows that are now having to pull that down from what software as a service provider? Are there additional costs from that network transit? How do you integrate it in with your workflows and your business intelligence? So there's a lot of things that go into it from that aspect as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, it is more of a benefit because you offload a lot of the mundane pieces from the infrastructure side of things, but it involves a lot more to think about from the data flow and the data access perspective.
absolutely.
Jim, you brought up a very
say,
good one I hadn't thought of before. As you guys, all these providers here know, we're getting a ton of assessments because I send them to you all the time. Everybody wants an assessment done specifically now. How do I decrease that? And that's something that I've always looked at, and we look at the CPU utilization, the RAM utilization. How do we get that down? But I never really took it from that aspect of, hey, what if we go with software as a service for these applications and start looking at the application itself? Why don't you just offload this to as software as a service instead of just saying, okay, here's how much you're actually utilizing, let's decrease that. So y'all brought up a very good point there. I need to start thinking about those things when I'm talking to customers as well.
Mac, did you have something to add there? I
was just going to say, on the theme of outsourcing your critical business functions, see the CDK ransomware situation in June. $1 billion in damage across 30,000 car dealerships globally. That third-party risk assessment of software as a service providers is becoming a big part of the evaluation process, and whether or not it makes sense is if they're operationally mature enough for you to hand that off to, and they're not going to be the reason that you're exposed. And there's obviously a number of examples of that, but CDK is the most recent and most impactful.
That's a great point. Yeah. So can we jump to the next one? Sorry, go talk about because I think that this is a story that we're building, right? So DR as a service, we go to SaaS, and then okay, so we've decided that these things need to be SaaS. Then how do we go into the hyperscalers? Where do the AWS, where do the GCP, where do the Azures make sense in here? And Thomas, if you'd start, great. Sorry, Larry.
Yeah. So the public cloud has always been the behemoth. And going back to my analogy, is the public cloud is like an Airbnb. You can get what you want for whatever your budget is. But just like when you go to an Airbnb, there's the hidden fees, there's your cleaning fee, there's your ingress, your egress. So why I think that a lot of folks are starting to really adopt and look at the public cloud is they're now looking at their workloads. And with this change with VMware, what ended up, I've been having conversations for, and I'm going to steal from my engineering team because they've been using this term, is phantom cores. Is we're evaluating customers who have been on-prem or they've been in, a multi-tenancy or a virtual private cloud. And they're like, well, with this change, we want to go to the public cloud, and this is why. And the reason being is that when you're looking at, let's say, a private cloud or an on-premise, and when you were building out those servers back prior to these changes, you were focusing on your RAM. You weren't focusing on putting 16 core processors in your units. You were looking at, I need to make sure that I have just enough RAM to not bring up my costs. So it's a balancing act. But now with this change from RAM to cores, the public cloud is actually looking very appealing because you can now start to go from the fact that you may have 12 cores in a single box, and you have to license for 16. So you're paying for 4 cores that don't exist and you can't even use them. And I think that's been a real shocker for folks, is that, like, I have to pay for something that I'm never going to be able to physically use. So it's really evaluating, what is the workload doing? Why is that workload living where it's living? And it allows you to really start looking at why and how. So when, on one hand, some workloads may work very, very well in Azure, and it may be the most cost productive because it may work really well. Others may need the elasticity of an AWS. And the thing that I'm seeing, and the biggest part of the uneasiness of going, well, it's VMware. Yes, it is. They didn't change how it's architected. And I will firmly say that everyone on this call is a subject matter expert within VMware in all of our 4 walls. And the reason why that the architecture didn't change, it was a cost model, is now we're looking at the big thing of, how do we make sure this stays secure? Because we're now having access to a lot more tools and functionality that was within the VMware stack that before it was a la carte. And when you start going to the hyperscalers, and I've had a lot of customers have, the buyer's remorse, is they went there and then they realized, ooh, there's all these cool things I can do, and they don't realize the cost associated with it. So what I like to look at it is, from our kind of point of view, is that the hyperscaler isn't scary, but you probably, if you aren't a subject matter expert, and to the example Mac used, and you aren't investing in the talent to particularly invest in that, then all of us here are able to help you understand where the workload should live. And I'm a big, big, firm believer, hybrid is not dead. Don't get rid of everything, right? You don't just take your whole workload and do a lift and shift. Absolutely not. What you want to do is you want to re-architect, you want to optimize. And by doing that, that's going to allow you as an organization to stay vigilant. And this does play into that exact disaster recovery scenario, right? Of, just because you're in the public cloud doesn't mean you're redundant. And that's where I think all of us are having these conversations of, how do I maximize my spend? And by now being able to pay for the 16 cores and use all 16 of them is a major benefit, and why people should be looking at their workloads today and how a public cloud can help augment what they're doing. And I'm not a big proponent of saying lift and shift. You need to understand what you're looking at, what is the business outcome, and then re-architect it for the particular public cloud that you're looking at to optimize it for your organization.
I might
and I'll
piggyback.
echo that. Like, a lot of clients don't take into account kind of the recoverability perspective when they do that. They do the lift and shift. Oh, hey, it's in the cloud, I'm covered. And then you have something like the CrowdStrike issue happening, takes your whole production down. You don't have another region. You don't have a copy of the backups. You don't have a copy of the systems up and running somewhere else. So then you're scrambling and kind of at the mercy of the software vendor to fix it. So when you kind of make that move to hyperscale, it's important to understand not just the application metrics of performance, it's also the recoverability, the availability, and how you get business continuity built into that, because that's a new world for a lot of organizations in building not just the hyperscale workload, but then also the resiliency into it as well.
I was going to say that's actually speaks to one of the biggest reasons why there's not a mass migration away from VMware as a whole, because of the entire support ecosystem and tool sets that customers already have an investment in. It's not just, am I moving away from VMware to an alternative? It's, I've got to look at my data protection solution, my any kind of replication software that we're leveraging for resilience, security solutions, anything that has integrations into VMware now, which is where everybody develops for because they own 80% of the market. The hyperscalers, you run into an interest or a similar issue when you move up there. And if you're talking to one of their reps, Tom mentioned it, Brent mentioned it about the lift and shift. AWS and Azure, GCP, they're all very incentivized to get you to lift and shift. And the story goes, move everything here. We're going to fund that effort, right? So there's a lot of grant programs that they will help you move every workload in its current form. Problem is, why don't you re-architect or refactor once you're there, and then you'll start to save money. And that's where most of the folks that are coming back and ending up in a hybrid scenario is they're finding these workloads that, oh, well, this is 60% or 80% more than what I expected to pay, because it wasn't, I don't know, fully baked prior to moving, right? So hyperscalers have an incentive to move you. So there's something worthwhile to think through prior to that lift and shift model.
Yeah. To steal Thomas's analogy train, it's like trying to change the tires on a car while you're driving down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have often recommended organizations don't do that in past lives. I'm like if the cost optimization is done post migration, I rarely see organizations do it and optimize. Rarely. There are people who do. I've been wrong, but rarely do I see people do that. And we're getting a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to go to the next one because I think that it actually dovetails because we're talking about the alternate hypervisors, right? We're already discussing that. You said something, and I'm sorry now I can't remember who said it. That tooling is the real issue. I have one client. I'm just going to say share this real quick. I have a client who I will say they're making an emotional decision. They would not say that. I'm saying they're making an emotional decision. They are moving off of VMware without fail. They are doing it. They're picking one. They're going. Before VMware, before Broadcom announced and made changes within that, Hyper-V had been kind of end of life, kind of end of support-ish, moving to Azure Stack and things, and we could get into a whole nother topic and I don't mean to go down that whole rabbit trail, but that calculus that happened at that same time created some dynamics in the market because people said, well, wait a minute, I can't, like Hyper-V would be the next alternative that would be the most logical, but now that's end of life, end of support coming up, and I have to migrate to Azure Stack. So just want to have you all, I know that you all handle various things, so obviously multi-cloud and all that stuff. So if you could just give us a little view of that, and we only have probably about 5 more minutes here, and then open it up for any QA that we have.
I would just,
Brent, I don't know, you're on. Okay, Mac, you go. You got it.
I was just going to say, I mean, I look at this in the context of just backup solutions, basic out of the gate. As a service provider for years and years and years, there was a lot of limitations around, if you think of like Veeam, Zerto, anything that's not agent-based. They're known for speed because they were built into and accounting for VMware. So when you move to a Nutanix, you're looking at a new ecosystem of data protection solutions, which again is just another piece that has to be evaluated. And now data protection, not just backup, data protection has to flow through multiple groups as well. So you think about just all the people that have to be involved in those decisions now with procurement, the security team, obviously the backup admins. I mean, it's just a bigger group that's having to weigh in on multiple decisions. And obviously that kind of just grows as far as project cycles are concerned. So we've seen many people just renew because they don't have the time and project cycles to evaluate all of the new technologies that are integrated with VMware, not just the VMware piece, which I think is where you're going with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the big advantages of working with a service provider is they don't have to go through all that evaluation, all that integration. They can really consume all those pieces from a service provider because we're constantly doing the R&D of the different hypervisors, the integration points, how those backups, how the replication gets done. So you mentioned Nutanix specifically. One of the, I guess, advantages of Nutanix is they have been hell bent on feature parity with the VMware ecosystem because they've been trying to catch up for so long. So a lot of the functionality is built in natively. So data replication, backups, but then you have companies like Cohesity that integrate natively in with AHV, things of that nature. So that is one of the advantages of the service provider world is you get to that constant R&D that they're doing. As a client, you get to take advantage of that and really just consume it as a service without all the distraction of hypervisor change, integration change, things of that nature. But the big thing there is from an operations perspective, what reliance do you have on your existing hypervisor? Do you have scripting, automation, skill sets, things of that nature that are already in place that would be more costly to redo than it would be just to kind of pay that VMware increase? So a lot of times it is a emotional decision that people are making that, hey, I'm so kind of fed up and so emotional about this change that once you start peeling back the layers of what it would actually take to make that full change, it is not just a power off here, power on there. There are other pieces that take into account from an operations perspective that you have to take into. But that's kind of where we landed was being able to provide different options for our clients. So there's ones that did make the emotional decision, or maybe they had a previous business relationship with Broadcom that maybe they're in competition, things of that nature, kind of the same talk track as moving to AWS because of competition. It gives them an alternative to even mix and match some workloads. So the offshoot of Horizon to KKR is also one of those other pieces because then you have additional VMware infrastructure licensing. Now you have the hypervisor. So, well, maybe we look at things like Citrix that can integrate in natively with other hypervisors, or something like Vision or some other type of hypervisor choice or broker choice that can then integrate with different platforms to remove that additional VMware layer of cost center.
Somebody might be muted.
I think I tried to get that through that quick enough.
Yeah, no, I think we're good. So we're coming up on the end. I have a couple bullets I want to kind of recap, and then we can open it up for questions as needed. So there's three things that I did, and I don't know if they're in the right order or not in my brain, but they are what they are. So one is evaluating the workloads, right? It's critical. We as an organization, any migration, you need to be looking at where is the best place to run this and why am I moving to? The cost optimization is something that is always a part. I worked for somebody who always said, look, cost is always in the evaluation. It is either going to make business sense to make a change or not at the end of the day. But first, we have to define what the technical hurdles are that a solution has to have before we get to the cost. Because if we don't overcome the technical hurdles, it doesn't matter what it costs. We're not going to do it. It was a tremendous statement. I was like, you couldn't be more right. So that's the evaluation process, is really evaluating where the workload should be. The next thing, and Brent said it, the reason for having a provider. I had a client when we talked about the CrowdStrike issue. They were like, well, I was of the opinion that part of the reason you have a service provider in your space working with you is they give you the ability to have alternate options. A service provider can have multiple irons in the fire, evaluating different capabilities, supporting different capabilities, whether it be CrowdStrike or Microsoft Defender, right, or whatever, right? So giving the ability to have that, you can't do that on scale as an organization independently. So to that point, right, it's speed to change, it's speed to support, it's speed to recovery when you're working with a provider across that. And then last but not least, from my perspective, is around cost. It is the ability to optimize in the VMware stack the solution based on that configuration. in a multi-tenant VMware, and I can't recall who it was only 40 minutes ago, when you swapped out the infrastructure, right, and we're able to optimize for CPU versus RAM and really drive down that cost. Those are the things you can't do as an independent organization, but an organization like the three that are here on scale have the ability to pivot and make those kind of changes and really deliver. So I guess the point being at the end of the day is that going at it alone is one way, and lots of organizations do that. Bring in a valued partner in order to be able to make thoughtful approaches and options that are not available to an independent organization is one of the places that I really see a major benefit here, and as we go through this. So with that, I've taken most of the time there. There's a couple minutes. Are there any questions from the folks? And Lindsay, if you could open that up, and we could do that. And no,
You must have done a really good job and answered them all preemptively.
or we've lulled them all. Okay, well, if not, then we're good. I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank the panelists really for your time and attention and your efforts up front to get this all done. We would love to hear from anybody with any feedback, and of course, if there's an ability for us to assist, we'd love to do that as well. Okay, great.
Thank everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.